My name is Micheal Beer, Director of Nonviolence International, and I will serve as your host today. As we get started, I want to thank all of you for joining us from around the world, including our three guests, Medea Benjamin, Carina Solmirano, and Jaap Van Oosterzee. I want to thank our talented and dedicated Nonviolent International staff, including Connor Paul, who's going to be running a lot of the technical stuff behind the scenes, co-director David Hart, and all of our interns, including intern Shiran Wang, who will be helping us today with our Facebook stream. Nonviolence International advocates for active nonviolence and supports creative, constructive nonviolent campaigns worldwide. We are a backbone organization of the nonviolent movement, providing fiscal sponsorship to partners all over the globe. We tell the transformative stories of dynamic emerging nonviolent movements that give us hope in difficult times and are reshaping what we view as possible. Our webinar series is called We Are All Part of One Another. This is a line from the great feminist nonviolent activist Barbara Deming that lies at the heart of all world religions and most deep spiritual practices. Some refer to this as the truth as oneness. Others note that we can't harm one another without harming ourselves. We have heard that we are tied together in a single garment of destiny. We are all in this together. COVID-19 is exposing the truth about our mutual destiny and also revealing the injustice and misguided policies of our world. COVID-19 is sweeping the world, causing much sickness, death, and economic hardship, particularly for those who are elderly and in marginalized and poor communities and countries. Mutual security will never be found in a barrel of a gun. To seize this moment of opportunity, we must change our way of thinking. The purpose of this call is to inspire all of us to redouble our efforts at eliminating militarism and to change how people think and institutions act. We want people over profit, human security over national security. We want an immediate end to civil wars. We want transparency in public affairs, whether financial security or public health. We want a world based on international law, and we want massive changes in resource allocations to reflect these values. Nonviolent responses, which we're talking about today, through mass, collective, and institutional action are needed. We need sustained campaigns that shift and elevate public opinion, that shift away power from corporations and authoritarian regimes, that move resources to life-affirming and stable security for all humanity and the environment. We need more ceasefires, such as in northern Cameroon, and more mutual aid efforts by citizens around the world. We need more support and appreciation for grocery clerks, sanitation workers, medical workers, and vast numbers of people, working people that make our societies function. We want courageous people and groups to nonviolently resist and, if necessary, disrupt national chauvinism and supremacy of any type of one group over another. We want draft resistance, war tax resistance, peace education in schools, peace constitutions, and further abolitions of entire classes of weapons. How do we get there? Today, we've got three great panelists from three continents who will talk with us. Each will speak for about 10 minutes and will speak in the order I introduce them. You will listen for about 30 minutes, all of us, but just wait. There will be plenty of time for active participation and conversation with them and amongst all of us on this webinar. I would like to introduce Medea Benjamin, co-founder of Codepink and Global Exchange. She is a leader in the US against militarism. She is deeply committed to nonviolence and has put her body and voice in dangerous situations and has suffered greatly for it. She will speak to the many of the horrific wars and sanctions the US is perpetrating and supporting. Jaap Van Oosterzee is a longtime peace activist from Pax based in the Netherlands. He and Pax are a passionate voice for the UN call for a global ceasefire and for investing in peace building as an alternative to militarism. Carina Solmirano was a longtime staffer at the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute and an expert on the arms industry and arms transfers. She's the new Control Arms Coordinator of the Arms Trade Treaty Monitor. She will speak to the need for transparency in public health and in the field of weapons. She will also speak to the enormous profits in the arms industry and the enormous growing military budgets worldwide. For that, we'd love to open the floor to Medea. Thank you all for coming. Thank you, Medea.
Well, what a great pleasure it is to be with you, and what a amazing group of people who are on this call. It's so exciting to look at the chat and see people from all over the world. And this is a time more than ever, where we understand this idea that an injury to one is an injury to all. But it's also a time that's so dangerous because we have this guy in the White House who's out of control. And not only has he taken us out of all these international treaties over the years he's been in power, but now to be defunding the World Health Organization at a moment when this is the organization that's the connective tissue to people all over the world, the organization through which we learn from each other, we cooperate, we coordinate, is just unconscionable. As the editor-in-chief of the prestigious medical journal, The Lancet, just said, he called it a crime against humanity. And so it breaks my heart to be even thinking that this is the person who represents us and is making the world so much more dangerous. On the positive side, for the rest of the world, we see the call for more cooperation. And I, like so many of you, have been extremely excited by the Secretary General's call for this global ceasefire. And when I first saw it, I thought, well, you know, it's nice, it's beautifully written. The allegories, the fury of the virus shows the folly of war. But then I thought, all right, you know, it's a nicely written call, but what does it mean? And as I've seen, the Secretary General is very serious about this and is really doubling down on efforts to try to get ceasefires around the world. And for me, one of the most exciting things happening now is around Yemen, where the Saudis, for the last 5 years, with the help of the US and the other Western nations that sell so many weapons to the Saudis, have been devastating that country. And the Saudis have refused to be serious about a ceasefire. And let's face it, this was an internal conflict that Saudi Arabia turned into an international one. But now they have called for a 2-week ceasefire. I think some of the stars have aligned, and that with the plummeting price of oil, with coronavirus actually very bad inside Saudi Arabia, and the recognition that Yemen, with its destroyed public health infrastructure, with the experience of the cholera outbreak twice actually that affected over 1 million people, that things are very devastating there without a ceasefire. And so there is the opportunity to see whether this will hold. And I think those of us who have governments that are somewhat involved in this, like we do in the United States, have to really push for our governments to be serious in supporting the ceasefire. It also means for the longer term, we have to be serious about stopping the weapon sales to countries like Saudi Arabia that are engaged in these horrific wars. And one more thing on Yemen is in the midst of this terrible need that Yemen has for international cooperation, the US has also cut off its funding for the AID programs in Yemen. And it's a pittance of money. It's about $70 million, but it means a lot to people inside Yemen. So many groups in the US are calling for the restoration of that money. But on the bigger scale, we have to talk about pushing for the ceasefire, and end to the weapon sales, and reparations for Yemen to rebuild that tattered, war-torn, catastrophic nation. And then I wanted to talk about 2 other places where I think the US is going against what the world community is calling for. One is Iran, and the other is Venezuela. Because in both of those situations, the Trump administration is actually inciting a new war. Many of you know that in the case of Iran, there was a deal that was put into effect that led to the Iran nuclear deal being signed in 2015, and it was going very well. Trump manufactured a crisis in Iran by pulling out of that deal, reimposing sanctions. And now we see Iran as the center of coronavirus in the Middle East, a very dangerous situation where the economic blockade has made it impossible for that country to import the goods that it needs, despite the fact the US says humanitarian aid is exempt. It's not true, but also because of the lack of revenue, the country just doesn't have the money to buy what it needs. And yet at the same time, the US is threatening to increase the military conflict with Iran next door in a proxy war in Iraq. And then a very similar thing is happening in the case of Venezuela, where the sanctions there have been devastating, where the government also does not have the revenues it needs. Both countries dependent on oil, the price of oil now so low. And this is a time where the Trump administration is saying, now that they're weak, let's turn up the screws. And so what they have done is indicted a sitting president, Maduro, on bogus drug trafficking charges when the real drug trafficking is happening next door in Colombia. I see we also have somebody here who's in Honduras. You know what a drug trafficker as a president looks like there. Then at the same time is sending US warships, AWACS. They're supposedly sending thousands of sailors and Marines to the region, either on the land or at the 9 US bases that the US has in Colombia. A very dangerous situation. I might add that we know that in the USS Roosevelt, the ship, over 600 of the sailors there contracted coronavirus. So just sending more US sailors on a fool's mission is really risky business for the sailors themselves. And there are, thankfully, a growing chorus of calls to say lift these sanctions, not just on Venezuela and Iran, but on the many countries where the US is using sanctions as a kind of economic warfare. And those of us who are committed anti-war activists have to recognize that the Trump administration has used this tactic more than ever in our past to try to bring countries to their knees. And so the calls are coming from the UN, the European Union, heads of states, lawyers groups, medical groups, all kinds of groups to say lift the sanctions against countries like Venezuela, North Korea, Iran, Cuba, Zimbabwe. Just as an aside, when I mention the name Cuba, I can't help but say this poor country of only 11 million people has been a model for the world community of international solidarity, sending over 800 doctors to over 16 countries. That is the kind of example that we should all aspire to in our own countries. And then finally, I want to say that this is a time when we really need to help people understand that part of the reason that we are in this tremendous crisis is because of the defunding of our healthcare systems and all the money that we pour into the military. And I know the other speakers will be speaking about this, but as a representative of the country that spends by far the most money on the military and is pushing the rest of the world to spend more money on their militaries, it really is a moment that we have to build our movements and build the understanding throughout the world that we can't solve the real crises of the climate crises and these epidemics, these pandemics, if we don't defund our militaries and start funding the needs of our peoples and the planet. And as part of that, it is very sad to see that the US is building up for new wars and prepping the US people to have a hatred of China and the Democrats a hatred of Russia. So as we move forward, we have to do our best to show people that these wars are manufactured for the profits of an industry that only can exist if we, that's my 10 minutes, if we keep killing each other. And I look forward to the discussion of how we can work much more together as an international community to move us from the killing to the caring and the loving and the compassion. Thank you.
the presentation part to Jaap Van Oosterzee from the Netherlands. Please, Jan.
So, hi. Yeah, let me introduce myself first and my organization. I'm Jaap Van Oosterzee. I'm working with Pax, and Pax is a Dutch peace organization. We are affiliated to Pax Christi based background, international, and we indeed have a faith bank, but a bit different from other Pax Christi movements. We've developed more into a professionalized NGO working on peace building and disarmament. I've been working for this organization for the last decades, first mainly on the Middle East, and the last years as leading our lobby and advocacy team. Pax works in 14 different countries with local partners on peace building, reconciliation, monitoring of war crimes, all different sorts of projects, always focusing on local civil society groups, ranging from artists, publishers, churches, faith-based groups, quite a lot of different sort of local organizations. And we work on a number of global issues and campaigns. Pax is a leading member of ICANN, the Coalition Against Nuclear Armament, and we won the Nobel Peace Prize 2 years ago. Still proud of that. And we also work on arms control, especially on explosive weapons in populated areas, on cluster munition, landmines, killer robots, armed drones. So it's a whole range. And on the responsibility of businesses for human rights respect in conflict areas. Yeah, that's a very brief overview. We work with about 130 people, mainly from our main office here in Utrecht in the Netherlands. Quickly, a few observations about peace building and COVID-19. First of all, what we noticed is that the whole discourse around the COVID-19 crisis is very much a warlike discourse. The words of war and combat and so on are used very much by governments, policymakers, opinion makers. And I think that feeds into a specific sort of response, a response that is also a warlike response. It's increasing the power of states, suspending democratic control. It's very nation-oriented, all our borders are closed, and it's a very masculine discourse. We do think we could try to propose a different discourse, a discourse where the response to a warlike crisis is not warfare, but peace building. And that we do think that it should be possible to put respect for human rights and peace building into the very core of response to COVID-19. And there are things that the responders from COVID-19 could learn from experience in peace building. Now, we are also still in the process of trying to identify how that works exactly, but there are a few things that we think we have clearly identified already in the last few weeks. We're all in a very steep learning curve. Well, first of all, that a proper response to a crisis like COVID-19 can only be a global one. I mean, this crisis is not over anywhere before it's over everywhere. If there ever is truth to that line in the strategic development goals that we should leave no one behind, it's now. As long as it isn't controlled for everyone, there is still a risk for the whole world that COVID-19 returns. So that's in a way already a way to put peace building much more in the center of our response. We try to, we've contacted all our partners in conflict areas, and of course we talked a lot with colleague organizations and tried to identify, to understand actually what's going on, and observed 7 main trends. We wrote a short article about that, which I hope that Micheal or other people from Nonviolent International can share with everyone. But that's, we did identified 7 main trends to watch and to follow over the coming time. First of all, we see that people in conflict are affected stronger by the whole crisis. There is no medical infrastructure left in countries like South Sudan, or in situations like in Israel and Palestine, the medical infrastructure is not accessible for all the civilians who are living there. And that situation is maybe even worse for IDPs and refugees in many conflict areas. We're specifically concerned about the situation of all the refugees on the Greek islands who are stuck there because Europe doesn't find a way how to deal with that challenge of refugees coming from Turkey. It was mainly people fleeing the wars in Syria, Iraq, and Afghanistan. A second trend is the impact of COVID-19, but also the response is different for women than it is for men. It does lead, we already noticed that, to the whole lockdown idea leads to more domestic violence. The response to COVID-19 in healthcare is very often not very gender sensitive. We notice, of course, that women are almost everywhere on the front line of working for healthcare, but the decisions are mainly taken by men. We think that could look differently. A third one is, I think many others have mentioned that already quite often, that it's states, but also other parties in conflict do abuse the situation and abuse it for their own situation. For us, quite alarming example is what's happening in Hungary, where the populist government simply took over complete power. I think the situation in the US is also quite alarming. We do think like that in almost every country that where we are working, that the government, but also other parties in conflict, are abusing the situation. In Colombia, for instance, paramilitary groups are very active again and targeting human rights and peace activists. Fourth one is conflict could get worse as a result of COVID-19. Although we don't see that many examples of that yet, but we see that, for instance, the Syrian regime is using the situation to continue fighting in Idlib. We see how Israel is using the situation in even tighter control on the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. So we are afraid that if the crisis continue much longer, we will see new conflicts arising again. A situation where we're specifically concerned is the situation in South Sudan, where as a result of the response and the lockdown, the peace negotiations between different parties have stopped, and the UN is not active anymore, is not really present. That could easily lead to a return of the conflict. A fifth one, but this is a trend, that all sounds very pessimistic, and there's a lot of reason to be very worried. But we also see a lot of examples of the power of the people. I think in our country, that must be the same in all Western countries, we see marvelous initiatives of citizens organizing themselves and organizing support and solidarity for people in their neighborhoods. And that's not different in countries like Syria, Yemen, or South Sudan. In fact, the people we have been working with very often are community leaders who take up a responsibility where the government is failing. Our Iraqi partners have been organizing most of the how do you say, the awareness raising about the risks of coronavirus, where the Iraqi government has completely failed in that. So 2 more points to touch on quickly. One is we're concerned about the future of international cooperation, especially a special concern is about the lack of inter-European solidarity. At the same time, we do strongly support all the calls for more international cooperation, and we try to build on the call for the call for a global ceasefire. We think that as a sort of moral call should also be translated to an action plan. And what we propose is really a halt to arms trade and arms transfer to conflict zones as part of that global ceasefire. So there's probably a lot more to say, but I'd like to leave it here. Thank you.
Jaap, thanks a lot. That paper that Pax put out on the 7 learnings during here, the COVID-19 crisis, is a terrific document, and we can learn a lot from it. I just want to remind everybody that the call for the UN by the UN for a ceasefire has more than 2 million signatures. We should really be pushing for 5 million now. These signatures do make a difference, and this UN call does make a difference. A lot of these conflicts have envoys, very specifically, who are in there engaged, trying to bring these parties together and bring peace. And having a UN ceasefire call is a powerful tool for them as they negotiate and try to bring parties together. So let's get that 2 million people up to 5 million for a global UN ceasefire. Thank you, Jaap.
Brittany has shared a link in the chat if you're looking for the article Michael and Jan mentioned.
And we'll also be sharing these links on Facebook as well.
Wonderful. Thank you. Carina from Control Arms, you're on.
Thank you so much. What I'm going to do, because I do have a very brief presentation that I want to share with you, especially because you will see in at least 2 of the slides that I want to share the magnitude of what we are talking today, the role that arms transfers and increasing military spending are playing today, and why this is something that we need to focus on and pay attention and try to convey to governments why we need to not only halt the arms transfers, but also to rethink how to reshift priorities in times of COVID and in times of extreme vulnerability for all humankind. Let's start. First of all, thank you so much, Michael, for convening this meeting. It's a real pleasure for me to participate of this particular discussion today. As Michael said before, I'm wearing the Control Arms hat today, but in the past I have also been part of CIPRI, which is an institution that you probably know, the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, where I did a lot of research on military spending and arms procurement. So it felt really good to combine some of these 2 fields of expertise or experience. So let me start telling you super quickly who we are. Control Arms is an international coalition with members from all over the world, working in many different fields, but in particular human rights, conflict resolution and prevention, peace building, humanitarian aid, issues of youth and gender, and we also have people that belong to parliamentary networks that are part of our coalition. Control Arms was created in 2003 as part of a global effort by civil society to push states to start discussions and the negotiations on the first global treaty that regulates the conventional trade on arms. And as you can see here, this is the Arms Trade Treaty that was approved in 2013. And its two main goals are to regulate the international transfer of conventional weapons and not least important, to prevent diversion of weapons to the illegal markets or illegal organizations like criminal groups, drug traffickers, terrorists, and etc. But the ultimate purpose of the treaty is to contribute to peace and security and to reduce human suffering. And I think this is very important and very related to our conversation today, because you know that when the Arms Trade Treaty was being discussed, a lot of the argument was, look, irresponsible arms transfers cause a lot of human suffering. It causes not only economic losses for many countries, but it fuels conflicts. It causes mass displacement of people, and in the end, it really affects the development of communities and of people in general, right? And also another very important purpose of this treaty is to promote cooperation and transparency. And I think these two words are very key today, because we are discussing how countries are still exporting weapons to conflict areas, and especially to countries, like Medea said, that are under very, very dire circumstances because they have been engaged in a long-term conflict. I'm just gonna go quickly with this. I wanna tell you something really interesting about the US and the Arms Trade Treaty, because the Arms Trade Treaty took almost 10 years to negotiate. The international community managed to get the US on board, despite the fact that the United States, as we will see in the next slide, is the largest arms exporter in the world. But when the treaty was finalized, the Obama administration signed the treaty, and last year, President Trump announced that he would withdraw the United States from the Arms Trade Treaty. And the argument, to me at least, I think it was really flawed, because Obama said, and he basically said this on a tweet, like everything he says, that the United States will never surrender American sovereignty to anyone, and that he wouldn't allow foreign bureaucrats, that those were his words, to trample on America's Second Amendment. And I think that there is a huge mistake here, because the Arms Trade Treaty does not interfere with the right of states to have their own weapons, to acquire weapons, or to arm themselves in self-defense. The ATT, like I said before, it regulates the international trade in weapons. Whatever happens within one country, it corresponds to national laws or the national systems that each country might have. So the argument that the ATT goes against the Second Amendment is really flawed. But what is the reality, and I agree with Medea, you know, I was teaching a class before joining you today. I teach a class on international relations, and we've been looking a consistent pattern here of the United States withdrawing from a lot of its international commitments. It did with the Paris Agreement, in 2018. It actually also withdrew from the Intermediate Nuclear Range Forces Treaty with Russia in 2018. So it's not surprising that the United States is now announcing, or last year announcing, that he would also withdraw from the Arms Trade Treaty, which is a figure that actually doesn't exist. It's probably, the likelihood is that the United States will for some years now ratified the treaty. It's just that you just don't withdraw from treaties like that simple. And so this is what I wanted to tell you, because in the midst of all this pandemic, what we still see is that, and this is surprising me, and it strikes me every time I see at these graphs, right, that the arms trade continues to increase. It increased during the financial crisis of 2008. It continues to increase now. And I don't know if you have heard, but I read a couple of articles just recently about how some countries are keeping their arms industries factories open because of the fact that if not, people will go unemployed. So there is something really particular about that we can discuss later. But if you see here, the usual suspects here with arms exports are the United States and Russia. They pretty much take most of the 50% of the market of international transfers are done by the United States and Russia. And Russia is not part of the ATT. The United States is a signatory, but it's not implementing the obligations of the ATT. And as I said, it just will not ratify the treaty for now. So these two states are probably not complying with the best practices and the best principles that the Arms Trade Treaty pushes for. And if you look at the second graph here, you will see who the main importers are. And you see Saudi Arabia. So Saudi Arabia is the largest, and it's been the largest arms importer for the last 5 years. Followed by India, Egypt, another questionable regime, Algeria, Iraq, Qatar. We see a lot of the countries from the Middle East just continue to be in the top 10 importers of conventional weapons worldwide. Only Australia and South Korea are parties to the ATT, and so they are actually obliged to the different principles of the ATT, but none of the other countries are part of this. Qatar is not part of the ATT, Saudi Arabia is not, China is not, none of these countries. So this is really concerning, because as you probably have heard and read in many articles, it's very difficult to calculate how much the arms trade is worth, but there is a number circulating out there in around $100 billion per year. So I guess that is money that could easily be allocated somewhere else. And so as arms imports and exports are increasing, so military spending. And I want to show you this. I tried to make it larger to make a bigger impact, but I think you see it, right? The United States stands out very, very, very strongly there, because it's the main and it's the largest country with the highest military spending budget, and followed by China, Saudi Arabia, France, Japan, Russia, a couple of other countries. And in total, and these figures are for 2018, and CIPRI unfortunately has not published its latest figures for 2019. So let's stay with this number, but I don't think the numbers will change much for 2019. So in 2018, military spending totaled $1.8 trillion. And this is a huge number. It's a huge number. So you have the $100 billion per year in arms trade on the one hand, and then you have the $1.8 trillion spent on the militaries worldwide. The US, of course, spends 36% of this, And it will continue to increase its military spending as announced per President Trump for this year. The thing that I wanted to say in terms of this is the relationship that sometimes we can make with military spending and the amount of money spent on arms transfers and issues of development. You know, at some point many years ago, when the conversations or the dialogue for the SDGs were taking place in New York, I remember being in one specific workshop where we tried to calculate how much it would take from that money to cover all the development goals. And it was striking. You would be surprised how much of the SDGs we could cover with the amount of money spent on militaries. And I just want to, you know, re-emphasize then the need, as my previous colleagues did, to campaign and to act, and especially under the circumstances of coronavirus, to continue supporting the campaigns around the world. Control Arms is supporting many of those, and specifically one in particular that you can find and encourage your constituencies to use on social media, which is the hashtag. You can use on social media, Facebook, Twitter, whatever you want, but start using because I think it's going to be really impactful. Stop Army Saudi hashtag. You can start using that as part of some of the campaigns that members of Control Arms are leading these days in places like the UK and Italy, and also in France and other countries. So I leave it there because I think I'm over my time. And thank you very, very much for listening to me.
Thank you so much, all of our presenters, for trying to cover an enormous topic in a short amount of time. You've done an amazing job. We now want to take questions and discussions, have a global discussion. We have about 100 people here, including Facebook. And this is how we build a world movement, is have world discussion and dialogue.
I thank for this very educative session. I really immensely benefited out of this thing. I'm talking from New York Nonviolence Internationals. My question is that the military hardware and the arms, it has got a specific purpose, and the illegal arms holding by the mafias, all those things, that's a different too. How do you correlate the relationship between the military hardwares and the illegal arms trade? Because these two are two different purposes. Is there any link between these two things?
So it's yeah, it's hard to respond probably.
Actually, ma'am, what I'm trying to mean that every country, they develop the military hardwares. Is, to me, I am an ex-military person. I was in Air Force Colonel. So to me, that military hardware that is extremely under control, it's not vulnerable to the society or any, unless it is used for some war or something like that. But the illegal arms that is which are held by the mafias and that's creating problem in the community and the society. My question is that, do you see any sort of problem for a specific country increasing its military hardware, which can also contribute to the illegal arms trade to some other countries? Is there any relationship between that, or there is no?
Yeah, no, okay, now I got it. Yeah, no, yeah, there is actually. Look, so here's the deal. Countries have the right to, to make different acquisitions, and especially, for their militaries, if it's under a transparent and clear doctrine of why they need it. For instance, you could see, and you can read sometimes and find these documents where countries say, well, I will actually purchase these weapons for this and this and this purposes. It could be, you know, I need to update some of my equipment because it dates back to the Cold War era, or because I'm, you know, creating a new program and you know, I need to, you know, modernize part of the systems. The problem though, and the problem that we do have is that sometimes, and especially, and that's why, you know, we have the Arms Trade Treaty, because what has happened in the past is that without any controls, many systems, especially, you know, the small arms and light weapons, because a tank is a little bit more difficult to, you know, divert from the legal, from an army to, you know, a criminal group. It's not impossible, but it's harder to do it, or the same with a helicopter. But it's much easier to divert weapons from, you know, smaller weapons from a depot, from, you know, the army or the air force in a country to criminal organizations. Part of the work that Control Arms does is also to convey to countries on the need to improve their national systems once they acquire, you know, systems, to avoid that those weapons, you know, could end up in criminal groups like mafias, like you said, or being used for different purposes as, you know, criminal acts like genocide and other violations of human rights. There is also a big issue when it comes to the diversion of weapons from one country to the other, you know, and this is something that we also work on and that we monitor very closely, and it's you know, the intention of states fulfilling obligations under the Arms Trade Treaty have to do with avoiding this type of situations. Sometimes, you know, you read in the newspapers that weapons that were purchased to Belgium are found, you know, decades later in another country, and in Central, you know, they might be found in Colombia or in Central America, and you wonder, but why, you know, why Belgium sold those weapons? Maybe, well, it didn't sell the weapons, you know, to Colombia perhaps, but in the transaction something got, you know, in between, and probably, you know, what started as a legal purchase and transfer became illegal because the intermediate phases failed.
Hello everyone, thank you all the speakers, and because of the issue of today that we are discussing, don't you think that is an opportunity for countries that are very high in their expenditure in military and modernize, and that now they realize that the enemy, using the same rationale of the war and that we have an enemy to combat, is not you cannot face with weapons. You need to face them with infrastructure, with health, with research. So don't you think that we can see, because it's something that we are starting to think in the NGO size, in cooperation. So don't you think that there is an opportunity for this country to say, okay, now it's time to invest because our enemy is another place? So I think there's that as an opportunity. Don't you think the same?
It's a tremendous opportunity to redefine the whole concept of national security. But the problem is we have to be doing that by building up a big movement to confront this military-industrial complex. We saw Donald Trump yesterday on national television talking about wanting to open up the economy again, and he talked about his conversations with the titans of US industry. And among those, he spoke about Northrop Grumman and Lockheed Martin. So he is saying that we have to get back to the way we were doing things. And of course, building weapons has been posed very much in the United States, at least, as a jobs program. And it has been bought into by Democrats and Republicans alike as an industry that provides a lot of income to our communities, as well as prestige and influence around the world. So it is certainly an opportunity to change the perceptions of the American people and show that you can't defeat the crises, whether it's the real crises of climate change or this pandemic or ones to come, by bombing them. We do have to confront the constant whipping up of not only the weapons industries as bulwarks of the US economy, but also, as I mentioned earlier, the whipping up of enemies. And I am very concerned now the way Trump is talking about the China virus and the Wuhan virus. And there were some interviews that our Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo, the #1 diplomat in the United States, interviews that he has been doing this week, and they've centered around China and talking about China needing to apologize, and right-wing radio show talk hosts calling for the US government to demand reparations from China for all the damage they've caused us. So this is of great concern, but yes, the opportunity is there.
I would agree that there could be an opportunity. I think there is good historic evidence from whether there are hardly any comparable crises, but a large crisis like world wars have also led to impressive positive developments in a way. And the First World War led to a huge swing in the emancipation of women, at least in a large part of the world. So I do think a conflict or a crisis like this can act in a way as also a motor for some positive change, but only if we start acting on that. And I think we really have to do a large effort to portray this crisis not as a conflict-like situation, but as something quite differently. But of course, I do see, at least in our society in the Netherlands, and I think that's at least true for most of Western Europe, that there's already a radical change in seeing health workers as the most important people in our society, the people everyone depends on. And second after that, the people who are working in supermarkets, like who are supplying us with food. These were not really the professions that were very high up in the social standards and now are seen as essential. So that could indeed give a different dynamic, but only if we are acting very cleverly.
My fear, so I agree that there is an opportunity there, but my fear is that the opposite happens, that instead of countries perhaps redefining priorities and allocating, for instance, more money towards health and development, that they would do the opposite. And we are seeing this the position of states becoming more self-centered on this pandemic. And as much as we see multilateral cooperation, we also see how countries are closing themselves. And in that environment, sometimes the opportunity is the opposite, which is to say, they will come and attack me, so I will actually increase my military and I will strengthen my muscle. And you know what I mean? It's the way I see it is that the danger is that the opposite happens.
I want to first of all just say how much I appreciate this really great analysis and discussion from all of the speakers and the panelists. It's really helpful for those of us trying to get kind of our hands around what's going on, keep up with all of the different issues that are being impacted by COVID-19, and then get an idea about how to actually do some actions and some solidarity on the ground. I also want to appreciate Jan's focus on the feminist analysis and gender issues. I think that's been really useful and it's really important. My question is kind of a follow-up of the last one. The fact that Trump did just publicly cut all of the US funding to the WHO, which has been a shock, really around the world and to many Americans at this critical time, and how we might, their ideas about how we might frame a message and a campaign around these cuts to the healthcare at such a critical time, directly compared to the military expenditures and the increase that many in the US and politicians have been calling for, and that juxtaposition. And again, in that new framing that Jan talked about, moving from war and ultranationalism and tough responses to peace building and other possibilities. So just an idea about how we might frame that. I think we have to react quickly and have the ideas about how we might do that.
It's a right, it's really a right question, but to say that I already know what the answer should be, I'm not so sure. I think what I did find remarkable, at least, is if we see the response in Europe, that also a lot of the potential allies of, or people who used to be more positive about Trump and the Trump administration were furious about this move. It doesn't make him much more popular, at least in Europe, and that's at least one step further. I think it also is a bit of a sign that the US is becoming less relevant in a way. I mean, imagine that China tomorrow offers to cover the costs, that part of the budget of the WHO. That creates a completely different dynamic. Yeah.
I'll just add to that. I was thinking the same thing, Jan, that it might very well be that China comes in to do that. Whether or not it does, China has, despite the fact that this is where the virus came from, it's provided real leadership. It has been sending supplies all over the world. It's been sharing its knowledge all over the world. It's been working with other countries to try to find a vaccine. And this is not missed on the countries around the world to see the US trying to shut itself in, the latest one being this criminal act of cutting off WHO. And it's interesting that when Trump announced it, he said, it's not about the money, because it's not a lot of money. He made it like this is about the principle. Well, exactly. The principle is whether or not we want to work as a global community. And Trump is desperately looking for scapegoats, and his scapegoats are the WHO and China. And unfortunately, with half of the American people, it seems to be working because they are giving him high marks for his complete bungling of this entire crisis, making the US the #1 victims of this virus. So there's a lot of kabuki theater going on in primetime TV that he is getting, but it does give an opening for real global leadership, as well as for American people to rise up. We at Codepink already put out a petition this morning quoting people around the world saying this is a criminal activity. And I'm sure other groups are doing that as well. And we should spend the time in the next couple of days really trying to build a large coalition internally and internationally. We've called on our Congress to try to block this. I think there could be an upswell from the American people, which is exactly what we need to be looking for in these days, that how do we both have the grassroots kind of movement internationally, as well as sympathetic governments around the world piling on to say no to this particular reaction to this particular crisis. But in a much broader framework, we have to look towards a world where the US is not the superpower and where we are building up alternative sources of power. I'm not particularly very comfortable with China being the alternative superpower. It has to be something that is much more spread out and much more democratic, but it is indeed an opportunity.
With all of you, you know, I think that, but that only goes to show the crisis under which the United States as a, you know, hegemon is these days. All these institutions that the United States helped to create and funded and promoted throughout all these decades are now being attacked. And when it's convenient, you know, the United States withdraws from these organizations or stops the support. And I have no doubts that China will be the one jumping in to do a little bit of soft diplomacy, supporting many of these organizations, and especially now under this times of pandemic. But I also agree with Medea. I don't know if I want, you know, China to be necessarily the next superpower, at least not in the terms that they seem to run internally their society. But I think that you know, China will take this opportunity to jump in, and it's been doing it. You know, it was the first country to send planes full of supplies and doctors to Italy, and I think it did to Spain. In Argentina, we just received, I think this week, 2 days ago, we received a plane with lots and lots and lots of medical supplies that the Chinese government sent to Argentina. So this type of diplomacy is working these days. But I agree that I don't know if I want, you know, that to be the case where we change one, you know, bad hegemon for another bad hegemon, right?
Thank you so much. Very rich discussion. I'm wondering whether Andre, who is in a civil war zone in Ukraine, who's at Nonviolence International in Ukraine, might just share with us for a couple of minutes what the situation is like in Ukraine and what investing in peace might look like in Ukraine. Andre, are you available to talk for a couple of minutes?
About Ukraine, first of all, I just would say you wouldn't get very far here with most people if you mention the word civil war, because that is not how most people in Ukraine, at least how probably the majority of the people in Ukraine see the situation. Their official discourse is that their country was invaded by Russia, and, you know, with support of you know, some Russian puppets that are so playing in the hands of the external enemy. So they most of the population does not agree with this discourse, and it's also very suspicious of any attempts to promote a peace agenda, because there's this dominating view that Ukraine is a victim of external aggression, and any kind of peace agenda has the risk of benefiting the external aggressor. That's why even organizations that work in the field of peace building try to use other terms. They don't speak as much about peace building. They speak about maybe mediation, conflict, dialogue, and things like that. So that's just you know, the reality here. The other thing, I just wanted to react to the previous speech about China. I think that's very accurate. Just yesterday, President Zelensky was speaking about the support, the situation regarding the coronavirus, and specifically thank China for its support. China is providing lots of support in terms of, face masks and tests and things like that. So he put China in number one as in the list of countries whose support he mentioned and thanked. So that's just another, US was not in this list at all. That's another thing I would like to comment on. And number three, there is something I might be sound a little bit as a dissident in this conversation, but I did want to mention, I think, some things that concern me. I think that if we want our message to get across, not just to people that have like-minded, that think similar to the way we think, but to the more general public, we need to see certain realities and certain arguments that are being put forward by people that we might disagree with. Like, I totally agree that it's a terrible decision, withdrawing support from the World Health Organization in this kind of situation. But we should say that there seems to be some base for criticism of the WHO in the way it handled the crisis, especially the first month and a half, when it basically simply followed the official information that came out of China. There's lots of evidence right now that the critical days and weeks when this whole outbreak could probably be contained was not contained because the authoritarian government didn't want to realize the problem. That's the way the authoritarian government works. First, they try to ignore the problem, then when they do not ignore, they react, and sometimes they can react very effectively, more effective than democratic government. But that happened after this period of ignorance, and so I think that we need to realize these realities. Or when we speak about problems with the U.S. policies regarding other countries, be it Iran, Venezuela, or whatever, I agree that there are serious issues with U.S. policies, but we should, I don't think you can blame the U.S. for the bulk of the hardships that people in Venezuela are facing. It's their government that is doing that. So we need to, I don't know, I might might be calling for something here that maybe is not, many won't agree with, but I think we need to be, if we want to get our message across, we need to hear better other voices, and we need to try to find arguments that that appeal to people that have other opinions. If we want,
thank you, Andre.
Yeah, sorry.
We need to wrap up. Yeah. We have a few more minutes left. Do we have others who have wishes to raise their hand? I did see a number of very, very good comments from a wonderful expert who we have with us today. Jeff Abramson, would you be able to speak to some of the things you've been posting in the chat line?
Hi all, Jeff Abramson. I live here in Washington, D.C. and help manage something called the Forum on the Arms Trade, and also I'm a senior fellow at the Arms Control Association. I was very involved in the Control Arms campaign during the ATT negotiations. I think it's very powerful to see this group come together. I think, picking on some of the threads, I do feel like this is a moment to reframe the conversation about what makes security, and to talk about human needs. And those human needs are health, the ability to have an opportunity in their life, and just sort of basic security. I think all the things we're talking about fit in that frame. And we know that this president in our country doesn't think that way, and clearly is not about cooperative problem solving in any sort of fashion. So I think a lot of these ideas around reframing what actually drives human needs and human security, as all of us are doing, is the message that we need to have. And I think on the last point, we definitely need to be able to talk with people who disagree with us. And I think they also can understand and recognize that frame as part of the American frame. And I think building from that piece of it is important. Specifically on the arms trade, I think it's going to be really telling to see moving forward how that changes, if at all. I do think the world could go in a couple directions. It could go into one where you have more authoritarian states using weapons and technology to control their people, or we could have a moment where we recognize that's not the approach we need. We need a different approach. And there's a whole range of campaigns in existence that are working along that in the humanitarian disarmament sphere that I think have a possibility for resonance. I have no idea if any of those comments I wasn't planning on making any are helpful, but I really am. It's great to see all the comments, great to see the speakers. I think there's a lot of alignment, and I think there's a lot of possibilities. And I try to include some links to some of the places I'm seeing those conversations, but I'm seeing a lot of conversations about how the world could be changed for the better, recognizing all the dangers. And I think echoing those and learning from those is really important.
Yeah, first of all, thanks all of you so much for your very interesting insights and contributions. I have a very short question. You talked a lot about changing the narrative, and I'm wondering what role youth can play in that, or where you see the role of youth across the world, basically, in that development.
Don't have a movement that has youth energy. It's not a movement, and the peace movement has been very, very bad at doing that. And you compare the environmental movement where there's so much young energy, and we've got to build that same kind of excitement and connections, because obviously there are tremendous connections between the environment and war. So I would just say in closing that the opportunities are what we make of them. If we can use this to redefine national security, build alliances with the groups in our country, for example, that have been working for Medicare for All, the environmental movements, the movements against racism, all of these kinds of connections that we need to make, we could perhaps come out of our shelters, out of our shells in a much better way to be demanding real change from the people who are misgoverning us.
I think in a way this crisis, at least in our society, shows a sort of immense generational social contract. Young people sacrificing their liberties and their education and so on, basically for the health of elderly people. People who are older than me are by far the most vulnerable. And I think that also puts a sort of responsibility on the older generations, that there's something we have to do back after this. And there is another issue which asks for a similar generational exchange, but then the other way around, and that's fighting the climate crisis. I think that's, the other thing I really wanted to say is, I do agree a lot with what Andre said. We do need to listen also to the arguments, and we might find out, which is, I think, quite common in this sort of huge crisis, that the people that we thought were our allies are not always necessarily our allies, and maybe some of our enemies are not always our enemies. I've seen, for instance, from the Dutch government, which normally is quite liberal and sees itself as a champion of international cooperation, is really disappointing when it comes to solidarity to other European countries, and so it does make sense really to listen to the arguments, and I agree a lot that thinking that China taking over the role of the US is not necessarily a very pleasant future. China might be more committed to multilateralism, and that would be a good thing, but they're not that committed to democracy and human rights, which is quite dear to us.
Just very briefly on to follow on Ruth, you know that, well, it's undeniable, right? That when youth mobilizes, it really causes change. And one of the really interesting campaigns that I that I'm following and that I urge you to follow is the one that Amnesty in France is conducting these days, which is called, I'm going to share here on the chat, I'm going to share the link, but it's basically, you know, again, with the arms transfers to Yemen, what Amnesty is doing is to kind of engage the youth in this dialogue, you know, and in urging the youth to take action and to ask governments to hold arms transfers to Yemen. So I think that's one of the many examples where you could see how, you know, people can get engaged in very pragmatic and concrete ways. So I'm gonna share now the link so you can check it out. I don't know if there's a version in English. I think it's only in French, but you know, I wouldn't be surprised. Yeah, I wouldn't be surprised that there are many other similar initiatives these days. And I wouldn't be surprised that many initiatives are formed in these days as well, as a response to what's going on and how governments are acting on coronavirus. So, you know, if any, I wouldn't be surprised that nothing happens. I think the opposite will be true, that young people from all over the world will you know, raise their voices because they are also part of you know, they are part of the situation as well. It's not that it doesn't touch them necessarily. I see it with my students, right? They are locked in their houses as much as I am as a professor, and they are, you know, getting really creative with many inputs and solutions on how we can improve the classes. And I'm just giving this, you know, silly example, but that's, you know, if you engage the youth, I think we can be surprised with the really creative ways in which we can change things. Thank you.
Thank you all for joining us today. Thank you for the marvelous presenters, Medea, Jan, and Carina from Codepink, Pax, and Control Arms. Thanks to everybody who participated in the call and the discussion and the dialogue in the chat room. And we indeed are all part of one another. Through this webinar series, we are introducing you to some of the many activists who inspire us. I've heard many really wonderful opportunities here today for all of us to get involved on so many levels. We hope you'll join us frequently in these global discussions that happen every Wednesday. We'll be back here, same time, same place, same venue for our talk next week. And please, again, copy the chat window because there are amazing resources and ideas there. And give a wave goodbye, everybody. Thank you so much.